American colonies, Ireland, France, and India harried, and Burke's great melody against it. The famous lines of W.B. Yeats, they inspired Conor Cruise O'Brien to write his great biography of Edmund Burke, The Great Melody. And of course, the it that Yeats was referring to, that Burke was fighting against, was injustice. And it is an incredible honor to be able to welcome you all to this year's Edmund Burke Lecture. A special welcome to His Excellency Ambassador Mishra and his lovely wife. A special welcome to an ambassador designate and various representatives from our own Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Department of Culture and other government departments. And a special welcome to all of you as well, because this is really a very special part of our calendar in the Trinity Long Room Hub. My name is Patrick Gagan. I'm the new director of the Hub. And I was watching the launch of the college strategic plan earlier, and the strategic plan for the university sets out a vision for what it wants Trinity to be. And that is about producing great research, education, public engagement, reaching out beyond these walls and really showing the value and the impact of what we do. And that is very much the identical mission of the Trinity Long Room Hub in the arts and humanities. And indeed, it is the very purpose of our Edmund Burke Lecture. And indeed, there is no one who really epitomizes those values more than our speaker tonight, William Dalrymple. And this lecture is made possible because of a generous endowment from the Fallon family in honor and a memorial for Padraic Fallon. And really what we try and do with this lecture is try to connect all of those themes about how the past very much shapes the present and very much informs how we approach the challenges going forward into the future. And it is an incredible honor, as I say, to be able to introduce William Dalrymple, who, let's be honest, needs no introduction. However, I decided as perhaps, like there are so many different aspects to his career. He is a brilliant writer. He is a brilliant author. He is someone who has this incredible love of the archives and archival collections. And when he arrived in Dublin today, there was only one thing and one place he wanted to go to, and that was to the Trinity Library to look at some of these incredible manuscripts. And we're so grateful to our college librarian, Helen Shenton, for arranging that, and thank you so much. But he is also someone who believes so passionately about engaging with the public and with the wider world. And you see that with his books, but you also see it with the incredible podcast series Empire that he co-hosts. And there you see them taking on everything from the history of India and the East India Company to Irish history, to most recently a 12-part series on Gaza. And it is very much showing how the world we live in is shaped very much by all of these historical forces. And those podcasts get millions of downloads. And but I also want to say something about his works, because today's lecture is based upon one of his more recent books, The Anarchy. He has that brilliant new book out at the moment, The Golden Road. But I want to read just a selection of some of the reviews of these works, because these are books that have won so many awards: the Wolfson Prize, the Duff Cooper Prize, the Hemingway Prize. The Anarchy was even named as one of Barack Obama's favorite books in 2019. But this is just a sample of the reviews of his works. Dalrymple is a superb historian with a visceral understanding of India. Dalrymple is erudite and wonderfully entertaining, so no pressure now. A wonderful storyteller, he'll make you fall in love with India all over again. And then from BBC History magazine, in exquisite prose, Dalrymple outlines the influence of the subcontinent upon global technology, astronomy, art, religion, music, mathematics, literature, and mythology. Now, there are very few scholars who could take on the incredible range of subjects, the incredible range of aspects that he does in his books and in that podcast series. and his incredible attention to detail, that incredible love of scholarship and of learning radiates through every single thing that he does. And so for my very first Edmund Burke Lecture, it gives me great pleasure to introduce William Dalrymple, who is speaking on the Anarchy, the East India Company, corporate violence, and the pillage of an empire.
Well, thank you all very much for having me here. I love any trip to Dublin, and Jane Ormeyer, who's organised my trip, took me straight down to the archives. We were looking at amazing manuscripts from Tipu Sultan's library, the Red Fort Library, all of which are here in Dublin, and a reminder that this is the story of the conquest of India. Is one that Ireland, I'm afraid, is also part of. As a Scotsman, I like to imagine myself as the descendant of William Wallace shouting freedom from the steps of the gallows. But the Scots and the Irish play their part in the story of British imperialism at every level. It's not just the squaddies in the barracks, but there are viceroys, governors from all our communities. And the story I'm going to tell today is one that has resulted in the treasures and the riches of India ending up in collections in Ireland as well as in Scotland and in England. And the word which obviously sums this all up is a Hindustani word, loot. Lootna is a Urdu verb, to loot, to pillage. And it's significant that it's one of the very first Indian words to end up in the English language in the 18th century. It was a word which was rarely used outside of North India until the 1750s, when it miraculously found its way into English to describe the sort of things you'd find in so many collections in Scotland, in England, and I'm afraid in Ireland too. But perhaps nowhere more than this place that I've started with today. This is Powys Castle on the borders of England and Wales. And if ever you want to get an idea of the scale of the looting of India in the 18th century, Powys Castle is probably a pretty good place to start. In this private house in the English countryside on the borders of Wales, there are more valuable Mogul treasures than in any collection in India or Pakistan or Bangladesh or Afghanistan. In this private house, now managed by the National Trust, you will find room after room of loot from India. Some of it from the battlefield of Plassey, such as the palanquin of Suraj ud-Dowlah, sitting here in this private house in the English countryside, left on the battlefield when Suraj ud-Dowlah fled the field. Go through to the end of this room and turn left through the arch you can see at the end of this slide, and you end up in the battle tent of Tipu Sultan, taken at the fall of Srirangapatnam. Now, Jane and I saw two manuscripts today in the Trinity College Library, also from the looted library of Tipu Sultan, who, contrary to British mythology, was not some savage barbarian, but a man who owned one of the best libraries in India at the time, and was a great scholar as well as a great warrior. And the reason that all this loot is here can be found inherent in this picture, which you have to travel under to enter the khazana, the treasury of Powys. And this picture is a very important one. It's not a great picture. Benjamin West, who painted it, who was a sort of jobbing imperial painter, he also painted the famous picture of the fall of Wolfe at Quebec, which many of you will know. He'd never been to India, and as one critic in the Times, I think, said when this picture was first exhibited at the Royal Academy, that the dome looks rather more like St. Paul's than anything you're likely to find in India. But what it shows is something that's crucially important. In the center of the picture, in cloth of gold, is a Mogul emperor. This is Shah Alam II, who was the man who was fated to lose the three richest provinces of the Mogul Empire to not the British Crown, and this is a very important point, but to a private multinational corporation called the East India Company. Now, many people, I think, today only know the East India Company from a bit part in Pirates of the Caribbean, where Tom Hollander plays the representative of the East India Company as Jack Sparrow rescues Keira Knightley from sort of dodgy situations. But the East India Company is an extraordinary story, and one I've spent the last 20 years writing about, because it is not only the first multinational corporation, it is in many ways the blueprint of the modern corporation. And in the 20 years that I've written 4 books, the company quartet, on the East India Company, its rise and fall, we've seen the world increasingly dominated by corporations more powerful than many nation states. Companies like Google or Microsoft or Alphabet or X have annual turnovers larger than any of the countries of sub-Saharan Africa's GDP. And like the East India Company, can buy whole countries. They have the ability to gobble up entire nation states. And the story I'm going to tell today is a story about the complicated battle between the power of the state and the power of the corporation. And it's very important to realize that Robert Clive, in the foreground of this picture, handing a document to Shah Alam or receiving a document from Shah Alam, is a representative of a corporation very like the corporations of today, a joint stock company with annual general meetings, with shareholders, with a share price that rises and falls. And as victories are won, the share price goes up, and as disasters take place, the share price falls. And it's like a heartbeat that runs through the history of corporate colonial India. Behind all the great battles and the cannon going off and the grand levees and balls at Government House and the gentlemen being carried in palanquins through the street of Calcutta, behind all of that is the share price of the company, changing every day like the heartbeat of a patient. And it is the reason that the East India Company existed. It existed only to make a profit for its shareholder. And the story that I'll be telling in the next 40 minutes is the story of a corporation which swallows the richest country in the world. When the East India Company is founded in 1599, England, this is before Britain, England, in 1599, the same year that Shakespeare writes Hamlet and Julius Caesar, England controls about 3% of the world's GDP. Mogul India produces about 42% of the world's GDP. And yet, one English corporation, for reasons that we'll see over the next 40 minutes, manages to conquer with its own private army, many of whom were recruited from Ireland, the richest country in the world. And it is, I wrote these 4 books over 20 years, and I've now moved on to other things. My next book's going to be History of Palestine, which feels oddly familiar too to anyone that's researching in British imperial history. But as it sort of recedes into the distance for me, it is such a strange story. How on earth did one single corporation in a single office in London gather the power to control huge chunks of the world. And it's a very object lesson in where power really lies in the modern world, and where, and most of all, how it can be misused. What we see here is Shah Alam giving something called, the caption on the bottom of the painting, when you go to see it in power, it says Shah Alam conveying the gift of the Diwani to Lord Clive. Now, Diwani won't mean much to anyone. It means the treasury. And what is happening is that Shah Alam is basically giving over the 3 richest provinces of his empire to a private corporation. So we've seen in our own time governments subcontract prisons, for example, to GS, was it GS4 Security? What's it called? Whatever it's called, some corporation. But this is on a massive scale, a corporate takeover of the 3 richest provinces, Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa of the Mogul Empire. Bengal alone had 1 million looms and was like the Silicon Valley of its day. It was the single most productive area on earth, producing high-quality cloth and cotton goods that sold all over the world, and which generated vast sums of money in the 18th century. And at this battle, Shah Alam passes this document to Lord Clive, and the corporation takes control. And what it does, of course, as any corporation tends to do, it asset strips what happens. And it ends in a terrible famine that we'll come to at the end of this story, that will be very familiar to an Irish audience. So this is where, I think we actually, hang on. This is where the East India Company was run from. It's a smaller, it's not even the building on the left and the right, it's just the 5 windows in the middle of the picture. And as you can see in this print from, I don't know, 1750s maybe, there is no sign outside advertising what it is. There's a railing stopping passers-by coming in, and the ladies and gentlemen in their tricorn hats and sort of puffy dresses passing along the street are just passing by without realizing that anything in particular is going on in those 5 windows. But it is from that tiny building in the center of that slide that the whole of India was conquered and enslaved. And an army larger than the British army a mercenary army, bought to do this job. And it starts with this character, Sir Thomas Smythe. Sir Thomas Smythe is a sort of Elizabethan Richard Branson, if you like. He's a sort of dodgy businessman in his sort of rough, nesting in his rough. His father was called Customer Smythe because he ran the London Customs, and they made a fortune taking a percentage of the customs at the Port of London. And he is known as Auditor Smythe because he was a chartered accountant. And it's his idea to found a corporation. And this is the extraordinary invention which lies behind all the events which we will talk about today. Because a corporation is something that has to be invented. It doesn't happen in most countries of the world in most of history. The normal model for businesses worldwide in pre-modern times is the family business. Marco Polo was part of a family business in Venice that went with his uncle and his father to China. The Medici were a family that found a bank in Florence. There is also the guild system, where people, all the wool makers in Suffolk, club together to go off and buy or sell their goods in Bruges or Ghent. But the corporation is something slightly different. It's where a number of ordinary people come together and pool their money to create a corporate entity which will outlive them and which has a share price depending on the amount of money that they've invested. And in 1599, this man, Thomas Smythe, having seen how much money that the Dutch made from their voyage to the East Indies. When the following year the Dutch arrive in London and try and buy English ships to enlarge the fleet of their corporation, the Smythe gathers patriotic Londoners and says, we can do the same thing. We shouldn't sell them our ships. We should sell our own ships to the East Indies and do what the Dutch have done and make an enormous amount of profit. So I think it's the 24th of September, 1599, he calls a meeting. The 22nd of September, they gather in this picture the shareholders who will initially invest. And extraordinarily, the document survives in the British Library. And you can read at number 1, look at the end of the thing, Mayor of London, £200. Number 2, George Bowles, £5,000, and so on and so forth. These are the initial investors prior to the first meeting, and 2 days later, they have a meeting in the Founders Hall in Mortlake Fields. And if Shakespeare, who was then writing Hamlet, had decided to walk out of the Rose Theatre, or wherever he was writing it, in Southwark, and cross London Bridge, and go to Mortlake Fields, he could have joined in the Founders Hall and witnessed this meeting. It happened in the middle of his sort of period of high production. This is the same year that he writes both Hamlet and Julius Caesar. And at this meeting, they gather money to buy some ships, and they appoint this man, Sir James Lancaster, to be the captain who will sail the expedition to the East Indies. Not necessarily an obvious choice, since Sir James Lancaster had just sunk the ship in this portrait on the top left on the way back from a similar voyage. But on the other hand, he was the only man in England who had actually been to the East Indies, which are not India. The East Indies in the 16th century speak is what we would call Indonesia. And in fact, the kind of furthest east bit of Indonesia, near Papua New Guinea, and particularly one island called the island of Run. And Sir James Lancaster then goes to Deptford to try and buy some ships to do this. They reject a creaky old hulk that will later be renamed the Mayflower and be responsible for other catastrophic events. But they instead buy a ship with the attractive name, the Scourge of Malice. This is not, I'm not making this up, this is not Johnny Depp's flagship. This is genuinely the name of the ship that they buy. But they have enough nous to realize that this is not necessarily the image they want to be giving out, so they rename it the Red Dragon, as if it's a nice country pub in the Welsh countryside. And off they sail. Except they only get as far just as off the cliffs of Dover when they are becalmed. The wind stops and they sink there and they sit there sort of bobbing in the ocean for a week. And people come and have picnics and laugh at them. But anyway, luckily the wind gets up and they sail round the Cape and off past India through the islands of Indonesia till they get to the island of Run. And just as they're about to land, they find a Portuguese carrack coming in the opposite direction full of spices. And rather than having to spend any money and buy some spices from the Indonesians, they just plunder the Portuguese carrack and transfer its goods from the hold of one ship to there, and then they sail home again. And many of the men who gave their name in this document do give their professions, if we can get the right slide, as privateer, which is polite Elizabethan slang for what we would call pirates. And so these sort of guys have all got sort of cutlasses, and they've cut their teeth raiding Spanish treasure ships coming back from South America. But what's interesting about this list is that although the Mayor of London is at the top, and all the rich people are giving £200 and £500 and £1,000, at the end of the 24 pages of subscribers to this venture are people who describe themselves as leather workers and vintners and bottlers. And this is the point of a corporation. Anyone can invest a tiny amount as long as they realize it may not come back. It's a gamble, investing in a company. If the company does well, your money goes up. If it goes badly and the ships sink, or like James Lancaster sinks the ship as he has the previous one, you won't get any money back again. But they do get this carrack back to London, and it sells for astonishing amounts of money, because previously all the spices that have arrived in Britain have arrived via Venice, who bought them from the Arabs in Egypt, who bought them from the Indians. So there's been about 3 markups. So if you actually go back to the island where the clothes are produced in the island of Run, you cut out sort of 5 layers of middlemen and can sell these things for a vast profit. And this starts the East India Company off on a very good footing, so much so that every investor has his premium tripled or enlarged 3 or 4 times, and the company itself can afford to buy a large plot on Leaden Hall Street, where it remains right through its history. It doesn't move at all. And that plot is the same one now occupied by the Lloyd's building, the Richard Rogers building. Bizarrely, there's no blue plaque or anything recording the spot. There's not a single notice outside the Lloyd's building saying this is where the East India Company was run from. And yet it's hard to think of another building anywhere in Britain which has done more harm to the rest of the world or changed the world more in every way than the East India Company in Leaden Hall Street. Anyway, they start off with this that looks a bit like a sort of Jacobean pub in Ludlow or something. But interestingly, you see the bottom layer is warehouses. That's where they initially put all the pepper and the cloves and the spices they bring back from the East. And the first few years are very small scale. The company nearly goes bankrupt a couple of times, but by the 1660s, they're able to buy their first dockyard at Deptford and begin making their own ships, and the whole thing gets going. And they lose initially their first set of battles with the Dutch. The Dutch this is the golden age of Vermeer and Rembrandt. Holland is the richest country in Europe. It invents the stock exchange. It has a whole variety of financial instruments that are hugely more sophisticated than the English. And in fact, the English only get them when William of Orange takes over England later well, I better not call it the Glorious Revolution. I can't remember what you call it. Anyway, that thing. It brings all these financial instruments to England. And it's this growing company that sort of sits biding its time while the Mogul Empire allows it to thrive. And the Dutch eventually do a deal with the East India Company whereby the East India Company surrender all their territories in the East Indies to the Dutch. And this is the greatest, although it's entirely accidental and it's a defeat, it's actually the thing that gets the East India Company going, because the initial trade was always in spices, which was the big deal of the 16th century, but the 17th and 18th century profits are going to come not from spices, but from textiles. And the place that makes textiles is India, and specifically Bengal. And by losing to the Dutch, the East India Company has to start all over again, founds a station in Surat, then Madras Patnam, which becomes Madras, then Bombay, where Jane has written about the Dubliners who played an important role in early Bombay, and particularly with the founding of Calcutta by Job Charnock, the whole thing takes off, because the cotton being produced in India is a fraction of the price and much higher quality than anywhere else in the world. But the Moguls do not have a navy. And so the East India Company become the means by which this wondrous textile production is exported around the world. And they beat off the Portuguese and the Dutch to become the prime shippers of Indian textiles, some very fancy, some silks, some kalamkaris, which are those sort of gorgeous embroideries that you see in Tudor houses or in Venetian palaces. But a lot of it just simple cloth that's better and cheaper than anything else available. So much so that you get deindustrialization in Mexico by the end of the 17th century because the English are exporting so much Indian cotton to the New World that the Mexicans can't compete. So the East India Company, by accident, finds itself trading in the most valuable trade of the era. And they make a very nice deal with the Dutch when they are defeated and have to pull out of the Spice Islands. In return, they're given a muddy island in the Hudson River called Manhattan, which turns out to be rather a good deal in the long run. So the big change happens on the death of Aurangzeb, the last of the great Mughal emperors, who dies in 1707. And on his death, the whole Mughal structure begins to shatter and fragment. And the great sort of period of crisis, here is the glories of Mughal Delhi, centered on the Red Fort, the richest city in the world with 1.5 million people, Chandni Chowk, the sort of elegant boulevard where one of the richest cities, one of the richest streets, most elegant of streets. And then in 1739, this guy turns up. This is Nadir Shah. Nadir Shah is the king of Persia. And he needs cash to fight his real enemies, who are the Russians and the Turks. And he decides, as he tells his French physician, that he'll go and pluck a few feathers from the golden feathers from the Mogul peacock's tail. And so he sets off, and his initial idea is just to go and raid the Mughals in Afghanistan. He takes Kabul, loots it, but then the Mughals don't reply, so he then goes and loots Peshawar, comes down the Khyber Pass, advances to Lahore, and then heads down to Delhi. And the Mogul Empire slowly creaks into life, and the Emperor Muhammad Shah, who's much more interested in watching musical recitals and reciting poetry and wearing feminine dancing kit than fighting on the battlefield, cranks three armies together, 1.5 million men mass on the fields of Karnal. But Nadir Shah has a small crack force of 160,000 cavalry armed with the latest gizmo, which is a weapon called the swivel gun, which he mounts on camels. And there is this epic battle when for 5 miles long, the Mughal knights in their outfits, like Aurangzeb is wearing here, this horse armor. Look at this sort of magnificent sight. Imagine 5-mile long wall of these armored knights heading towards the Persian lines. And at the last minute, the curtain parts, and the light cavalry pull aside, and there are the swivel guns, and it's all over in about 2 minutes. The swivel guns fire a lead slug that can pierce armor, and the whole of the first line of the Mughal cavalry are massacred. That night, the emperor, Muhammad Shah, is invited to dinner by Nadir Shah on the right, and accepts the invitation very foolishly. And he has a magnificent dinner, and there are dancing girls and all so on. And at the end of it, Nadir Shah merely disarms his bodyguards and captures him. And they then go into Delhi 2 days later on Muhammad Shah's elephant. And there then takes place one of the great loots of history. There is so much, 280 wagons filled with diamonds and jewels. Everything that the Mughals have taken from the rest of India are shipped off to Persia, including the Koh-i-Noor, its sister, the Darya-Noor, the Peacock Throne, And there's so much money that Nadir Shah announces there'll be no taxes in Persia for 10 years, and that he will give his enemies in Russia and Turkey free gifts of a wagon each of diamonds. And today, when you go to Topkapi or to the Hermitage, the greatest exhibits are the leftovers that Nadir Shah sends to his enemies to tell them how rich he's become through the looting of Mughal India. But for Mughal India, it's the end, because there is no more money after Nadir Shah has retreated to pay the civil service or the army. And this extraordinary empire, which had at one point controlled almost all of India, all of Pakistan, all of Afghanistan, and a fragment of Persia and Bangladesh, shatters into 1,000 city-states: Jodhpur, Jaipur, Tanjore, Hyderabad. And in a single generation, this country, which had 1.5 million men under arms in the mightiest army, which had been this extraordinary force for 150 years, disappears from the map. And the question is, who is going to succeed it? Is it going to be the Sikhs in the Punjab? Is it going to be the Marathas in Bombay? It's neither of them. What it is instead is, bizarrely, these guys in shorts. Very natty little outfits, you might think, but actually the cutting-edge military geniuses of their day. So this is the moment that the two rival European trading companies, who've been quietly making vast profits, the French and the English, the Compagnie des Indes and the East India Company, find their moment. Because during the reign of Aurangzeb, there's been an extraordinary military revolution in Europe. And Frederick the Great of Prussia has realized that the age of cavalry and knights is all over. What you can do, which is much more effective, is train up simple peasants with muskets and horse artillery and fragmentation shells, and you can revolutionize warfare. And both these trading companies import this new technology to India, but the French do it slightly earlier than the English. And in 1740, there's a battle of the Adir River outside Chennai, when 500 French-trained sepoys in this extraordinary outfit succeed in defeating, I think it's 100,000 Mughal cavalry. And for 20 years, this new military revolution allows the two rival companies to take over and defeat any Indian rival. And they can cheaply train up Indian peasants in this new technology. It isn't rocket science. Muskets, bayonets, horse artillery, things that are easily manufactured in India. But for 20 years, there's no Indian force that can stop them. And the only resistance begins in the 1780s, 20, 30 years later. But for 20 years, these two corporations, existing for profit, battle out, first in the Carnatic, then in Bengal. And it is the English one that wins out because it is a more ruthless mercantile operation. The French one is run from Versailles. It's full of the cousins of the slightly duff cousins of the French king who can't be employed in France, are sent off to run the East India Company. And the English win first in the Carnatic. So this character intervenes at this point. This is Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab or governor of Bengal. He's the Mughal governor, and he decides that he doesn't like the English, and he goes and invades Calcutta. And it happens just at the same time that the English have sent out this character to attack the French at the beginning of the 7-Year War. This is a character called Robert Clive. And he is, if you like, the Lord Voldemort of my book, The Anarchy. He's a completely fascinating character. He is a delinquent from Shropshire who had started protection rackets in Market Drayton at the age of 16, threatening to flood shopkeepers' houses if they didn't pay him off. He on the way out to India, he falls off the back of the boat in a drunken moment and nearly drowns, is only just rescued, but for which history may have been quite different. But he is a remarkable fighter. He's not only remarkable on the battlefield. 18th century warfare is still very much a kind of set-piece war where people obey kind of, laws of chivalry and face each other, and it's a lot about negotiation and so on. Clive attacks people at night, at 4 a.m. in fog, from the rear during thunderstorms. He doesn't obey any of the rules of war, and he's an enormously successful fighter who can judge an opponent's weakness. And he continues to use this ability to frighten his opponents. Later, when he fights corporate politics back in the East India Company, and he destroys his rivals there. And then in Parliament, where he effectively creates an East India Company party in Parliament, buying boroughs of the British legislature, rotten boroughs, for the East India Company, and create, by the 1780s, something like 70% of parliamentarians are either ex-East India Company or have substantial shareholdings in it. So it's an example of how the Elon Musk of his day can use money to buy political power. This game begins now. And Clive is the person who develops the rules of it. And he is sent off to Bengal to try and get Calcutta back from Siraj ud-Dowlah. And his mission had been to attack the French, and he does that pretty quickly in Chandanagar and wipes out the French settlement. And the East India Company has already got enough power for several squadrons of the British Navy to fight on behalf of this private corporation. So the state power is sent out to protect corporate power at this point. This is before the East India Company has its own army, which it very rapidly gets after this. And then just when he's about to return home, Clive gets a letter. And the letter is from a crucial figure in this story, and he is called the Jagat Seth, the banker of the world. And he is a Marwari Oswald Jain originally from Rajasthan, who'd set up shop in Calcutta and invented a financial transfer organization, like a hundi system, whereby a promissory note would be issued and money would appear in one of his offices around. So if the Mogul Emperor wanted to get the tax money of Bengal to Delhi, rather than putting all the gold into chests and driving it up the Ganges, which in the 18th century was an increasingly difficult thing to do as order breaks down and the Marathas are riding around and the Sikhs are riding around and the Jats are riding around and everyone can loot this gold. Instead, the tax money of Bengal is paid into the local offices of the Jagat Seths in Bengal, and the emperor can draw it in Delhi, minus 10% cut. So inventing this financial transfer system, the Jagat Seth grows the greatest fortune in Asia in 2 generations. And it is the Jagat Seth that approaches Clive and said, this guy, Siraj ud-Dowlah, is a danger to you British, but he's also a danger to us. So why don't I offer you personally, Robert Clive, £1 million, and we'll give another £1 million to the company if we can borrow your troops and attack Siraj ud-Dowlah and topple him and replace him with a man that I know is more reliable. And Clive, without any authorization from London, says yes, and does this. And the battle where this happens is the foundational battle that generations of English schoolboys have learnt about as a heroic story called the Battle of Plassey. And this is the sort of picture which appears in English textbooks. In reality, the Battle of Plassey is a financial transaction. Both sides are working for the Jagat Seth, the bankers. And the Jagat Seth has bought not only Clive, but bought the main general of Siraj ud-Dowlah, who's called Mir Jafar, and halfway through the battle, Mir Jafar, it's quite difficult to navigate this thing. Mir Jafar just walks off the battlefield. Siraj ud-Dowlah is captured, killed. His bruised and bleeding body is then paraded through Murshidabad. And then Clive turns up, and they throw open the treasuries, and he takes his million, and he takes the million for the company, and all the money is simply put into boats and punted down the Hooghly to Fort William in the beginning of this massive loot, which will then continue over the next century. Clive, overnight, becomes the richest self-made man in Europe and uses this money to finance an extraordinary political and business career. The East India Company uses this money to buy an army. And for the next 30 or 40 years, the East India Company recruits an astonishing number of Indian soldiers. Another battle is won 10 years later, or 8 years later, at the Battle of Buxar, when the last Mogul resistance, the Mogul Emperor, Shah Alam, the governor of Awadh, Shuja-ud-Dawla, and the successor of Siraj-ud-Dawla, 3 Mughal armies meet. They very nearly defeat the company, but the company, just when the company is trying to evacuate its troops, thinking it's lost, the barges don't turn up to evacuate them, so they have to hold their ground. And meanwhile, the Mughal troops are going off to loot the East India Company tents. All order breaks down. The company holds its line and eventually wins the battle against having thought that it's lost it. And Buxar is the final death toll. It's after this that the Diwani takes place. And what we see in the years to follow is the building up of an extraordinary mercenary army. I think there are something like 12,000 sepoys at the time of Plassey. By the time of Buxar, there's 60,000 sepoys. By the time of 1799, which is the year that the British are beginning to rearm to fight Napoleon, the East India Company army is 200,000 men, double the size of the British army. And this is not the British army. This is a private army owned by the shareholders of the East India Company. So if ever you're worried about Elon Musk, or he may have a spacecraft, but he doesn't yet have intercontinental ballistic missiles, which is what this effectively was for the time. So this is an extraordinary thing, a corporation with annual general meetings and a share price that owns the largest modern army in the world. And over the years to come, the East India Company, province by province, expands out over the whole of India. And they fight the Marathas, they fight the Sikhs. They send, after each of these battles, figures like Captain James Todd here on his elephant out to map and assess the taxes for each region. And they develop a brilliant business model. In the old days, when the East India Company was founded, huge quantities of English gold would be shipped out in chests to Bengal to buy the cotton, the silks, the kalamkaris, and all the goodies that they then would trade. But by this point, they don't have to ship out any gold at all because they just tax the Indians. So they tax the Indians to buy cheap Indian products whose prices can be now controlled because they're in charge. They then ship those back that had cost them nothing more than the price of the army and the forts to England to sell. But they then develop an even cleverer model when they realize that there is land, there is a crop that they can sow on the marginal land which hasn't been planted, and that is the opium poppy. And from the 1780s onwards, the East India Company becomes the world's largest narco operators. They make Pablo Escobar look like Andy Pandy. And they grow, the whole of Bihar and half of Bengal is given over to the opium crop. They ship the opium illegally into China, which wants the opium as much as sort of Trump wants Venezuelans importing crack cocaine. And they force the Chinese, they force this opium into China, where it's then gobbled up. They hook as much as a third of the entire Chinese population on opium. The irony, of course, being it's now Chinese opioids partly, which is responsible for the opioid crisis in America, where the thing has been reversed. But anyway, that's looking forward. In China, they use the profits of the opium to buy Chinese tea, which they then sell in India, which up to this point has been drinking coffee, in Europe, and finally, after 1774, in America. And it is East India Company tea, which is popped into Boston Harbor at the Boston Tea Party. So by this point, the East India Company, which we saw 20 minutes ago starting as a little sort of Tudor startup with a kind of half crackpot captain buying old junky ships that nearly sink and barely sail, has transformed itself into the most powerful corporation in history that not only owns all of India, but is running the largest narco operation in history to China, using that to finance the extraordinary expansion of the tea trade, which is the biggest of the early 19th century cash crops. And it is like an octopus, which has got its tentacles now across the world. It is the largest employer in Britain. That's leaving aside the actual employees of the company directly. Its subsidiary work, building ships, tarpaulins, ropes, tar. It's the single largest employer in the country. And it is, as they say, too big to fail, or maybe not, because what happens in 1772 is that these guys have run amok with absolutely no government supervision. Couldn't happen today. They so short-sightedly asset strip Bengal that they effectively kill the goose that's laying the golden egg. And in 1772, a famine breaks out in Bengal. This is something that, again, might sound a little familiar. Now, famines have been a regular thing in Indian history. They weren't created by the British, but because they're a regular thing, they're normally the product of a failed monsoon. And India is the gift of the monsoon, that where the monsoon rains fall, everything is fine, and crops grow, and it's wonderful. But almost every 5 or 6 years, a year will come when somewhere a monsoon will not arrive and no crops will grow. And because of that, there is a system of in India, traditional Indian governance, that you build granaries. You tuck away grain in fat years for the lean years. And that also, when the famine years come, that you employ people to build large, glamorous projects and employ them so that they can buy food and can then survive the famine to grow crops another year. And a lot of the big, splashy projects of Indian building that you see, such as the Imambara in Lucknow, which is this wonderful long expanse of domes that goes on for miles and miles, are actually famine relief projects where people have sort of splashed out and built something enormous to employ people to keep them alive during a famine. But the East India Company has got a bunch of 16-year-old brats who've come out and feels no responsibility to actually govern the land. They're just there to hopefully amass enough money by the age of 30 that they can return home, buy a country house, and buy a rotten borough. So they just let them starve. And they continue to tax. So the first year, everyone uses up their what little income they have. Some sell their children into slavery. Some sell off their plows. They eat their seed grain. By the second year, again the rains fail, and there are now deaths in the hundreds of thousands going into the millions. And famine breaks out on a massive scale. There are bodies in all the rivers. There are dogs eating the corpses in Calcutta. And you get accounts of this written by East India Company whistleblowers. At this point, of course, there are no foreign correspondents or CNN flying in to record these things, but you get graphic accounts written by horrified men of conscience, and they are all men because the East India Company doesn't employ women, who then send anonymous reports back to the Gentleman magazine, to Blackwood's, to the Spectator. And these reports are then read in America, where the East India Company has just been allowed to sell its tea. And this is one of the major early causes of unrest in America, which leads to the Boston Tea Party, because the Americans worry that what has been happened in Bengal will happen now in Massachusetts. So, in the end, the East India Company goes spectacularly bankrupt in 1772. They can't pay their debts. And from being this massively rich company, it has to apply to the Bank of England. It has to apply to the Bank of England for a loan. The Bank of England is a new institution which has just been founded for exactly these sort of circumstances, but they don't have enough money to bail out the East India Company. So what happens is that the company, Parliament is recalled, and Parliament buys a 50% stake in the East India, or 51% stake in the East India Company, in the 1774 Regulation Act, it's called. And this is the moment, for the first time, when the British state becomes involved in this whole business. Up to this point, it had been the ultimate libertarian dream if you're an employee, or nightmare if you're being ruled by these people. A completely unregulated financial organization, entirely focused on profit, with no one controlling it. But from this point, the government is in charge of it. And the first guy who is sent out is Warren Hastings, or rather, he's already there, and he's appointed by the government to run it. But a whole bunch of regulators are sent out, including a guy called Philip Francis, who is a friend of Edmund Burke, which brings us to this lecture hall. Incidentally, before we get on to Edmund Burke, this is the East India Company's flag, which may look vaguely familiar, provides some inspiration for another flag that comes up at this time. And the company, now in government control, decides to sort of rebuild itself. So now is this sort of massive affair that looks not like a Jacobean pub in Ludlow, but like Buckingham Palace. And from its council chamber, which is here, the director's court, India is controlled. A room in Leadenhall Street controls the whole of India. And by this stage, too, the East India Company has its own extraordinary docks. This is where this is looking from where Canada Wharf is today, where the kind of all those enormous tower blocks, looking over to Greenwich in the distance. It also has its own, Brunswick dock is where it makes the East India Company clippers. And rather like Venice at its peak, turning out whatever it is, 5 galleys a week from its shipyards, the East India Company produces something like 40 clippers a month from these dockyards, which go out moving opium, tea, tar, saltpeter, back and forwards across the globe. So it is this massive multinational corporation now under government control. And this is the point when we come to Edmund Burke. And Edmund Burke, who is on the right side of so many causes, gets the fact that the East India Company is this massively corrupt and evil force. And it had been from the very beginning. There's as the first generation of the East India Company, the first ever governor of the East India Company is caught bribing parliamentarians with cash in brown paper envelopes and is put in the Tower of London. And it's really the East India Company which invents what is now an industry, corporate lobbying. There has never been a corporation before which has realized, well, there have been corporations before the East India Company, other than the Muscovy Company, which precedes it slightly, and the Levant Company. But it's kind of like the third ever corporation. But it's also the first corporation to realize that a very, very rich corporation can buy politicians. And you can find ways of controlling legislation so that your corporation will become richer still. So the East India Company not only offers bungs to politicians in more discreet ways than it used to. It doesn't still offer cash in hand, but it does find ways of transferring shares, for example, to parliamentarians. But it also has, by the 1780s, so many of its own ex-employees in Parliament that I think it is 80% of parliamentarians either have East India Company shares or are East India Company ex-employees. So it's a sort of total racket. So Burke gets onto this. Unfortunately, in my view, he goes for the wrong man. He gets into the hands of Philip Francis, who is put up to the job by Robert Clive. Now, in my view, Robert Clive is the real evil genius, the guy who is the center of the corruption. Clive is not only brilliant on the battlefield and a brilliant fighter, he's also a spectacular insider trader. When he returns to India in 1765, he's the first person allowed to open the dispatches from Bengal, and he learns that the Battle of Buxar has been won, this moment which I described earlier in 1765, when 3 Mogul armies are defeated, finally giving the whole of North India over to the East India Company. What does Clive do? He commissions a fast ship to send his lawyer back to England with instructions to sell all his property and buy East India Company shares before the news arrives of the Battle of Buxar. And he mortgages his entire properties in England, all his estates, including what has just been given to him as his barony of Plassey, which is Plassey in Ireland, as it's renamed. He triples, I think, his holding in East India Company shares, and then sells them again the day after the news of the Buxar has come and the share price has spiked. So all this sort of thing, which we hear about our politicians doing in the 21st century, is pioneered by this. And Burke is onto that. But he goes for Warren Hastings. This is Philip Francis who puts him up to it, who is Clive's attack dog. And Warren Hastings, who undergoes, I think it's a 16-year trial with Burke leading the prosecution. Burke gets the fact that the East India Company is this monstrous, corrupt organization, but he goes for the wrong man. And Warren Hastings actually is the nearest thing there is. I mean, he's by no means an angel, but he's the nearest thing there is to a decent East India Company employee. He speaks perfect Persian, Bengali. He starts the Royal Asiatic Society. He commissions the first Sanskrit translation of the Bhagavad Gita. He writes, I think I love India a little bit more than I love my own country. He plays the guitar. He goes hawking. He's the kind of character that you'd really quite like to have dinner with, and who writes beautiful letters. And he's the guy that Burke goes. And as you can see from this picture, he looks more like a sort of clergyman about to give a sermon from a pulpit than he does some sort of monstrous fat plutocrat looting India. And in the end, Burke's efforts fail. Clive backing Francis, backing Burke to attack Hastings, and Hastings wins his case after 16 years in court, and is cleared, although he's broken by this incredible affair. But for historians, it's a spectacular treasure trove. And if anyone in the audience is thinking of doing a PhD, there's still so much material from those trials which no one's looked at. It's a spectacular, and it's all about the corruption of this corporation. It's an incredibly modern subject. So I'll just close with the quote of the way that the words that the Lord Chancellor uses as he opens the trial of Warren Hastings with Burke as the chief prosecutor. And the words run as true today as they did then. Corporations, he said, have neither bodies to be punished nor souls to be condemned. They therefore do as they like. Thank you.
I feel like I'm going to sing now. I feel like I'm going to have to sing now or something. Just to say, we've had some brilliant Edmund Burke lectures over the year. This has been well up there as an exceptional lecture, but it's also been very special to have a lecture that brings in the great themes and interests and passions of Edmund Burke in the Edmund Burke Theatre, and it is the annual Edmund Burke Lecture. But we do have a small presentation for you before we go to questions. Thank you very much. So, So it just remains me to say, a thanks to William, but also a thanks to the team in the hub, Katrina, Christina here, Ricky, Emily, Aoife, the brilliant work there. But also we're a team of directors as well. And it was my predecessor, Eve Patton, who invited William. It was her predecessor, Jane Ohlmeyer, who came up with the brilliant idea. We're all here tonight. And it is such a wonderful community in the hub. And it's on nights like this that we really see the benefit of all of this. And also a big shout out to our special dean, Carmel O'Sullivan, who gives us such wonderful support as well, and Helen Shent in the library, and all the wonderful people who come to our events. But William, just to say, spellbinding lecture, enthralling, and I think you lived up to all of those reviews that I read out.
No pressure.
You lived up to it in person as well. So our thanks to William Dalrymple.